I'm a economic and urban geographer, and I do a lot of research about international retailing. Today, I will give give a presentation about carbon emission and climate change in East Asia. So um, so first of all, carbon emission is a term or a topic that we hear quite often in our daily life. So carbon emission is basically the release of compounds such as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But we often hear another a term which is greenhouse emission. Greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that can trap the heat. Since carbon is present in many greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, carbon and carbon emissions are usually used as kind of like blank terms for different greenhouse gases and their emissions. The primary cause of carbon emission is the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, gas, oil, and natural gas. So essentially, human activities, burning fossil fuels, are the main driver of carbon emission. There are many types of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases mainly include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. As we can see here, some greenhouse gases don't have anything to do with carbon, but they're still covered and the liberally utilized term carbon emissions. This is not only because it's simple to just use a word carbon emission, because the standard unit for measuring the impact of greenhouse gas emission is carbon dioxide equivalent. So carbon dioxide equivalent basically express the global warming potential of each greenhouse gas in terms of how much carbon dioxide would create the same amount of warming. For example, for nitrous oxide, its GWP, global warming potential, is about 273 times of carbon dioxide in a designated time period of 100 years, which means that 1 ton of nitrous oxide within 100 years in the atmosphere would create 273 times of heat as 1 ton of carbon dioxide. We already identified that burning fossil fuels as the main driver of carbon emissions. Now we can identify the main sources of carbon emission or greenhouse gas emission by economic sector. So the first is electric power. Basically, electricity generation, in all kinds of power stations, they actually account for quite a large amount of greenhouse emissions. Transport sector, emission from transportation, such as burning fossil fuels for cars, vehicles, trains, airplanes, also account for a large proportion. The industrial sector, burning fossil fuels in industrial sector for either the purpose of utilizing energy or a certain chemical reactions, Commercial and emission from the commercial and the residential sectors usually uh, for the purpose of heating or utilize greenhouse gases for the purpose of refrigeration and cooling. Agricultural sector can also generate greenhouse gases such as from the livestock such as cows, from crop production, and even from soils. So these are the major sources of greenhouse emission by different economic sector. So now that we've already identified the greenhouse gas emission, or what we simply call it carbon emission, we needed to identify what is the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect itself is a very important natural process on the surface of Earth. So basically, the heat balance, the energy system on Earth's surface, actually the balance depends on the energy entering the system and the energy leaving this system. So when the solar energy reaches the Earth's surface, some of the solar energy will be reflected back to the space, where the other portion of the solar energy will be absorbed by the Earth's surface. Once this energy is observed by the Earth's surface, it will be released as a form of heat, or sometimes we call it infrared radiation. Infrared radiation. So some gases in the Earth's atmosphere, they can either slow or prevent the loss of such heat. And these gases are the greenhouse gases. This is the original video that I want to share. I will just skip this video. So basically, greenhouse effect itself is a natural process, and it is necessary. Without the greenhouse effect, the Earth's surface would be too hot during the daytime and too cold during the nighttime. Nevertheless, within the past 2 centuries, greenhouse effect has been intensified by human activities, especially through the burning of fossil fuels. We've already identified that greenhouse gases can function as a blanket, which trap the heat in the atmosphere, and they can lead to the problem of global warming. Now we will see what is global warming. So, global warming is the long-term heating of the Earth's surface that has been observed since the Industrial Revolution in the middle of 18th century due to human activities, primarily fossil fuel combustion. So these activities have increased the heat trapping greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. In our daily life, we often hear that people tend to use the term like global warming interchangeably with another term, climate change. Nevertheless, the two terms actually have distinctive different meanings, and they are not interchangeable with each other. This graph here shows that the general pattern of global surface temperature compared with the 1915 to 1918 average global surface temperature. As we can see, a clear trend of increasing global surface temperature. Here we see that the year 2020, tying with 2016 to be the hottest year on record. So basically, this general trend of increasing global surface temperature has been the result of intensified human activities since the 1950s. Well, climate change itself is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define the Earth's local, regional, and global climates. So Climate change is actually the result of combined natural resources and human activities. Natural resources such as the changes in the solar energy output and the variations in the Earth's orbit. They can also contribute to climate change, but these natural processes have been overwhelmed by human activities. So we needed to clarify that the two are actually different from each other. Well, global warming can be seen as a consequence of global climate change. Climate data provides evidence of key indicators of climate change. So climate scientists, they have utilized observed data from the soil, from the air, and from the space, together with computer models to identify the changes or like specific evidence of climate change that we can see from these different aspects. The most commonly identified indicator of climate change is rising sea levels, as well as changes in land and ocean surface temperature. Other indicators includes ice loss at the polar regions and in mountain glaciers, intensified hurricane activities, droughts, wildfire, as well as changes in cloud and vegetation covers, as we can see from these images. So basically, climate change can be identified through many extreme weather patterns. Now, we will use East Asia, this world region, as a case study to identify how carbon emission and climate change has impacted this world region. The figure and the chart here identify the country by country breakdown of global carbon emission for 2023. As we can see from this pie chart, China currently is the world largest emitter of greenhouse gases. In East Asia, in this world region, China, together with Japan and South Korea, they account for about 36.4% of global carbon emission, where China itself accounts for about 31%. The changing global carbon emission patterns can also reflect the increasing share of China's greenhouse emission in the world total. We will associate this increasing emission pattern of China with its economic development trajectory. So since the late 1970s, economic reform have been implemented in China since 1978. And since then, rapid economic growth has taken place in China, especially in 2001, with China's accession to the World Trade Organization, WTO. As we can see here, in 2021, China, the carbon emissions in China surpassed that of European Union. And in 2005, the carbon emissions in China surpassed that of those of United States. By 2020, China's carbon emissions have already exceeded the combined total of all advanced economies, which include United States, Japan, as well as European Union. So in terms of per capita carbon emission, advanced economies or developed countries generally have a higher level of per capita carbon emission. Where we see that the per capita carbon emission in China also increased dramatically in the recent 2 decades. So in in 2020, we'll see that it actually exceeded the level of advanced economies. By 2023, for the first time, the carbon emission per capita in China exceeded those levels in Japan, although it was still about 1/3 lower than the like per capita carbon emission in the United States. But China is on that trajectory, to witness an increasing per capita carbon emission. So we might have a question: is this trend to be perpetual? This trend to be perpetual, as we can see, the different climate change manifested through different type of extreme weather patterns in East Asia. Here we see the regional and global ranking of East Asian countries in carbon emissions, both in Asian Pacific region and world in the global comparison. China, Japan, and South Korea, the three largest economic entity in East Asia, all rank very high in both regional and global ranking. As we can identify from these two charts. So basically, we'll see the dominance of China in global greenhouse gas emission, both regionally and worldwide, globally. Nevertheless, we can also see the differences in terms of the sectoral breakdown of sectoral differences in terms of carbon emission. These chart here shows us the carbon emission from different sectors such as power industry, transport, industrial combustion, and industrial process. As we identify that the power industry, power generation, basically accounts for the highest percentage in all of the three East Asian countries, China, Japan, and South Korea. Nevertheless, we do see differences between these three countries. The transport sector in China accounts for a much smaller percentage in its total carbon emission than those in South Korea and Japan. On the other hand, if we pay attention to the red and yellow color, we see as industrial combustion and industrial processes together, the industrial sector in China accounts for a much higher percentage in total carbon emission than those in Japan and South Korea. We know that China is currently termed as the world's factory. In by 2023, China alone accounts for about 30% of global manufacturing economic output. So this country is called the world's factory. So we can identify its great input in industrial sector, especially for manufacturing purpose. That is why we see the higher percentage of industrial sector, both in industrial combustion and industrial process in terms of carbon emission. On the other hand, we see the much smaller transport sector of carbon emission. So China currently is still a developing country with a relatively lower private car ownership, especially compared with Japan and South Korea. And we can see that the transport sector has a much higher percentage in both Korea and Japan, which can be considered as advanced economies or developed countries in which the transport sector account for a higher percentage in total carbon emission. Climate change in East Asia also manifested itself through many extreme weather patterns. Currently, China faces with risks of climate change, such as sea level rise, intense heat waves, severe and frequent storms, droughts, and floods. Similarly, both Japan and South Korea are faced with risks such as coastal flooding and erosion. Increased heavy rainfall and typhoon intensity. So typhoon is an East Asian counterpart of a hurricane. It is the same as a hurricane, but it's a regional a word used in East Asia, as well as problems associated with agricultural yields and food security. Excuse me. We already identified that climate change in East Asia as manifested through these extreme weather patterns, weather conditions. Now we see that the dominance of China in the world carbon emissions. So what are the adaptation and mitigation efforts these countries, not only China, but also Japan, currently the world fourth largest economic entity, and also South Korea, a highly developed, advanced economy. What kind of adaptation and mitigation efforts these countries should implement? We'll see that because fossil fuel combustion is a primary driver for carbon emission. So expanding the use of clean and sustainable energy should be the priority, a priority of efforts for these East Asian countries. Also, because cities are the hubs of population, economical growth, to to reduce or to mitigate the problems associated with carbon emissions, efforts should be made in the cities in terms of sustainable urban development and transportation sector, such as the promotion of electronic vehicles. So electronic vehicles nowadays in China are more popular than the traditional oil-based vehicles. Also, managing land use and forests for carbon sequestration, basically vegetation such as agricultural land, forest land, and grassland, they can actually trap greenhouse gases, so that management of agricultural land, grassland, and forest land are the most cost-effective ways to reduce greenhouse emission. China is very clear about the negative consequence of greenhouse gas emission, and this country is clear about the negative consequence as being the world worst polluter, the largest emitter and the worst polluter. So since 2000, China has invested strategically in all fields of clean and sustainable energy, such as wind and solar power, clean hydrogen, thermal, geothermal power, as well as in terms of batteries that can be used for electronic vehicles. Such efforts can be identified from this combined wind and solar capacity. So currently, China has the greatest capacity in terms of wind and solar energy for clean energy utilization. These two images here show us the solar thermal power plants and wind farms. So China is actually on its way to reduce greenhouse gas emission. And there is still a long way to go for this world largest polluter. And we'll see that in the future, these efforts will be more prominent. Thank you. That's my a presentation about the carbon emission and climate change in East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. Yes, Tim. All right. Well, we'll keep things kind of rolling. And I know Dr. Zhang might have to depart momentarily to go teach her class, her regular students. Um, so let me share my screen here, and then I'll see. Okay. So thanks, y'all. Again, just a very quick intro of myself. My name's Zach Smith. I'm a associate professor in the history department. And I'm really excited to talk about this particular topic because in addition to teaching classes on kind of modern Chinese history and modern Japanese history, I also am lucky enough to teach a first year seminar course here at UCA on the global history of student protest. And I've always been kind of really attracted to protest as a strategy. And I think protest is a subject that always kind of really engages students um, in kind of thinking critically about their world. So I'm going to be talking today, excuse me, about some opportunities to kind of engage environmental activism in China in kind of the recent past. And so before we begin, I want to do a quick little mental exercise. So this will involve a certain amount of feedback. You can put information in the chat or you can unmute. Um, but I want you to just take a moment and I want you to picture a protester. Um, Try to I mean, close your eyes, imagine what a protester looks like. What are they doing? How do you know that they're protesting? What comes to mind when you imagine a protester? And so now people can either type in the chat or unmute and kind of share out. Take a couple of seconds to think about it. Okay. Even just in the first two responses, we have some consensus. Young, signs, uh, a group with signs and megaphones, a sort of person holding a sign, joining in a group. We oftentimes think of protesting as happening in a big group. Um, Maybe people are masked. Maybe people are kind of worried about their identity. A group with signs and megaphones. Several people have mentioned young people. We think of protests as being kind of a young person's activity. Yeah. I think it's kind of Dr. Windenface says older women also. Certainly, I think more recently in the U.S. we've seen a lot of older women involved in protests. Oh yeah, so Dr. Striquerda says, students occupying an administration building. We think of protests as kind of taking place at, major public centers or buildings or the like. So yeah, so we kind of have I think a pretty common shared understanding, kind of what protest looks like. And certainly I think in the Chinese case, perhaps not so much for my students now, but I think certainly folks who are my age or folks who are teaching or a little bit older, um, when we think of protests in China, we probably also think of, young people holding signs outside of government buildings, specifically in this case. I think the one kind of protest that really comes to everyone's mind is the kind of pro-democracy movement led by students in Beijing and other major cities who occupied Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989 before being sort of forcibly dispersed by government military forces in June 4th of that year. And I certainly think that this protest is indeed among the most kind of important and impactful of the kind of modern period of Chinese history. But in some ways, I think the kind of exclusive kind of Western media focus on this event has blinded us from a couple of really important truths about the way protest works in China. First of all, this form of protest is not new. Students had been protesting in Tiananmen Square as early as the May 4th movement of 1919. I think sometimes you hear these kind of reductive arguments about China being a quote unquote, collectivist society where people are less likely to protest. As for me, as a historian of 20th century China, it's nothing but one protest after the other. In so many ways, 20th century Chinese history is defined by student protest. Not only that, but I would argue that actually protesting in China has not gone away either. Now, just because it's not gone away doesn't mean it doesn't look quite different. So, do we still see major sort of gatherings of students in the thousands in public squares like we did in Tiananmen Square in 1989? N No, not as much. Certainly not in mainland China. We can talk about Hong Kong being kind of an example of similar large-scale protests. But I would argue that actually there's still protest happening all the time on the ground in China. It's just much more likely to be taken up by seniors and much more likely to be taken up in using kind of strategies and repertoires that are not just marching and holding signs, but using other means. So for my kind of presentation today, I want to ask some questions about, what are the issues kind of motivating a lot of popular protest in China today? I think you can kind of maybe even just tell from this example, this photograph of the Forbidden City, kind of coated in smog, that one of the main sources of concern is pollution. Um, but I also want to ask, how do we kind of engage these protests and these issues in the classroom? And I'm going to argue that one of the best ways, I think, to engage kind of contemporary social movements in China is to do so through documentary films. I think there's something really kind of special and unique about the documentary eye, and kind of the role that it plays in helping us kind of understand what's happening in China kind of on the ground. Another reason why I think documentaries are especially important is because they've had a major social impact. I think one of the most recent examples of kind of more environmentally focused documentaries in China having an impact is this film, Under the Dome, by an investigative journalist, Chai Jing, who used to work for, CCTV, the sort of centralized state-owned television agency. Um, she had a daughter who was born with a birth defect, a tumor that was attributable to the very large amounts of air pollution suffered by many living in China's major urban centers. And it prompted her to kind of launch a documentary project tackling the sort of impacts of air pollution in major Chinese cities. It very much takes on the format of, I don't know if y'all remember Al Gore's film Inconvenient Truth. It's kind of like a TED Talk plus. Um, this film was kind of independently produced and released and was actually viewed by over 100 million people, creating a huge sort of stir before it was ultimately banned by the PRC government. And I think this example kind of shows that documentaries have quite a large impact, even in China today. And so they can be a really useful way of kind of thinking through how everyday people are kind of responding to issues of concern. So let's get into what are some of the issues that people are kind of concerned about. Unfortunately, more recently, there hasn't been as much sort of English language available polling about everyday kind of attitudes and opinions in China. But I did find this snapshot of areas of public concern from a 2016 Global Attitude Survey by Pew Research. This was kind of very much at the start of Xi Jinping's second term. Chinese presidents typically have 5-year terms. So this was kind of the start of his second term. Um, and I'm curious, and this is also people can jump into the chat. If you look at this list of what everyday Chinese people are concerned about, um, what kind of jumps out at you as being kind of unique or distinct about these sets of concerns, maybe compared to the concerns of today in the US? I know it's a little bit small, so hopefully folks can see okay. People can just put in the chat maybe something that jumps out at them as something that seems maybe of a higher concern in China than it would be here in the US. Or, hmm, no, Celine knows. Yeah, conditions for workers, actually, a majority of people are concerned, but maybe of these mentioned, it's comparatively less. Hmm. Yes, there's intense concern over kind of the regulatory framework for like sort of the Food and Drug Administration or its equivalent. How do we know that our medicine and our food is safe, free from contaminants? Um, yeah, Peter notes that corrupt officials is not, corruption is not maybe, although that could be changing, but maybe previously not um, a major concern in the U.S. Very high here. Um, mentions no mention of immigration or border issues. I should say too, quick note about corruption and corrupt officials. I think this is also one particular instance where you can actually see the impact of Xi Jinping's campaign infrastructure. Although China is a one-party state, presidential administrations in China still do run on kind of campaigns with major themes, and certainly one of the major themes of Xi Jinping's rise to leadership was rooting out corrupt officials, which I think has kind of the unique quality of both speaking to broader everyday frustration with the government, while also serving as a pretext to eliminate one's political rivals. That can be, okay, we're going after corrupt officials. So I think there you kind of see in some ways the influence of the administration itself. But yeah, so some of the concerns I think might be you know, common in other areas, although I think it's pretty surprising that the gap between rich and poor is so high in what is, ostensibly a communist country. And then people haven't mentioned it yet, but right here in the middle, right, we have water pollution, air pollution, right, environmental quality issues. And I think some of these concerns kind of really connecting safety of medicine, food, water pollution, air pollution, really speak to kind of a shared concern about the environment and pollutants in everyday people's lives. So these issues are front of mind for a lot of everyday Chinese folks. So and they'd be the kind of thing that would lead people to protest. But we've already said there's not kind of protest in the form that we might normally think of as, young people marching in the streets with signs and whatnot. So what does protest look like? I would argue that a major component of protest in China that is quite unique to the Chinese political system is what's known as the Xinfang system or the petitioning system. This is basically a state-sponsored channel for petitioning the government, basically raising a set of concerns and bringing it to your local officials. Some of this work comes from a really fantastic book by a scholar named Xi Chen about social protest and contentious authoritarianism in China. And so I think the main sort of argument that this book wants to make is that just because China is a one-party state does not mean that there isn't a fair amount of pushback against the government, or that the government doesn't care what everyday people think. That in fact, if you turn your attention to kind of these petitions or letters offered by community groups, you can see that even since in the decades after the 1989 protests in Tiananmen Square, there's actually been a marked increase in collective protests kind of against local and national government officials, um, bringing concerns to bear. And so if we kind of think of each of these collective petitions as a form of protest, we can see that in many ways protest in China is on the rise since 1989. So with the rest of my time, I want to kind of go through what are some of the main sources of these collective petitions and protests, and then suggest some documentary films I think are really great ways to sort of explore the underlying issues that are accessible, to high school students or to undergraduate students. Um, so one major source of collective petitioning, unsurprisingly, is industrial pollution, right? As we sort of heard from Dr. Zhang, the almost total transformation of China's economy over the last 5 decades has required the construction of enormous amounts of new industries, many of which produce not only quite a lot of greenhouse gases, but can produce kind of industrial runoff that threatens local communities, especially local communities that are agriculturally based or are previously dependent upon things like, soil quality or air quality and the like. And this has actually been a pretty consistent pattern. I'd say this is one of the most common sources of protesting and collective petitioning in China. And this is actually an area where protesters have had a great amount of success. Probably the most well-known incident occurred in the city of Shifang in Sichuan, China, where in 2012, local officials had to cancel plans to build a large copper factory due to essentially a popular outcry from the residents of the town. We've seen similar protests like this in kind of all over China geographically, in Jilin, in Dalian, Ningbo, Kunming, and elsewhere. One thing that I think is kind of interesting about this protest, if you actually look at the signs that the protesters are carrying, the top sign up there on the right is very much a pro-government slogan. Long live the Chinese Communist Party, long live the People's Republic of China. And yet the bottom part of the sign says, we have to drive out the Hongda molybdenum copper alloy factory and preserve our beautiful new Shifang. So we can see that these protests are not, kind of going out of their way to say we are not anti-government, but we want to sort of work with the government to protect our communities from the potentially negative consequences of these industrial factories. So one film that I think is a really fantastic way to kind of engage collective petitioning against industrial pollution is this film called The Warriors of Chiogong, directed by Ruby Yang. It was actually nominated for an Academy Award in 2010 for Best Documentary Short. And one thing I'll say too, very quickly, almost all of the films I'm going to be recommending in today's presentation are available for free online. This one is available on Vimeo through Yale 360, which is kind of an environmental teaching organization. So this film, it's about essentially a small community, mostly a rural farming community, who's dealing with the fact that a brand new kind of chemical production factory has been built next door, and the runoff is essentially killing the livelihood of these farmers. And so the film really follows this one elderly farmer, Zhang Gongli, who kind of uses his community connections, but also a mastery of kind of modern bureaucracy to organize a community protest against a neighboring chemical plant. And the way that they sort of put this protest together is through one of these petitions. So actually, going back 2 slides, this image you see here up at the top right of people kind of affixing their fingerprint to this petition actually comes from this film, The Warriors of Chiogong. And one thing that I think is especially effective kind of about this particular documentary is not only does it kind of give you insight into kind of the mechanics of how this petitioning Xinfeng system work, um, but I also think it helps capture also everyday attitudes towards kind of the local and national kind of government. So, I think in the US, a lot of times when we hear about the Chinese government, we we see media depictions that basically, I'll just be blunt, kind of depict, Xi Jinping as sort of the bad guy, and kind of the Chinese nationalist government as the bad guy. But one dynamic that I think you see here, and this particular protest happened during the previous Hu Jintao administration, is that for many kind of everyday villagers in China, it's the local government who's the bad guy, and the national government is the sort of group with kind of the resources and the ability to kind of intervene on behalf of everyday people. So you actually kind of see in this example kind of a lot of trust and grace extended towards the nationalist government for the sake of kind of advancing the aims of this group. I also think you see a great example of kind of rural community organizing and the role of kind of non-governmental organizations and how they work to kind of address issues in the People's Republic. And my final thing that I truly love about this documentary is sometimes you'll hear an argument both from leaders within the PRC, but also from international observers and folks like The Economist that um, while folks acknowledge that China is not a democracy, there's this kind of argument that, well, we need to first kind of promote economic well-being. And we have to first promote kind of production and economic growth. And only after we've become a sort of economically successful country can we sort of deal with these issues of kind of democracy and freedom of speech and things like that. And what to me is most remarkable about this film is that it shows that it's not the urban, wealthy benefactors of economic growth that are turning their attention to issues of direct democracy. It's actually some of the poorest and most rural and least resourced communities in China that are making most effective use of the tools of direct democracy in a way that I think really scrambles kind of a lot of the common narratives about economic and political growth. So another major source of protest has to do with kind of working conditions and energy needs. So we already saw from Dr. Zhang's presentation that China is one of the world's largest producers of coal and coal-based energy. Um, and before I kind of dig into the documentary, I want to point out something that's very important, I think, about the way that coal production operates in China, which is that it is not geographically consistent. So when we say like, oh, China is the world's largest coal producer, I think in some ways that's misleading. China is a very big place. And there are large swaths of China, especially the kind of coastal urban parts of China, that don't have an intimate relationship with coal production. Meanwhile, there are other parts of China, like especially in Inner Mongolia and Shanxi province, where coal production is a major part of everyday life. And so, in this context, I think a lot of the consequences of coal production are very unevenly distributed. In much the same way that I think our global economic system kind of unevenly distributes quite a lot of, uh, um, you know, economic exploitation and things like that. But that in some ways, because of this uneven distribution, I think some of the worst challenges of producing coal can be made just as invisible to, urban college students in Beijing or Shanghai as they can, college students here in Arkansas or high school students here in Arkansas. So one of my absolute favorite documentaries, period, this is probably the one I'm about to talk to, is probably my single favorite resource that I want to share with y'all, is a documentary sort of exploring the conditions of coal mining in Inner Mongolia. And it's a film called Behemoth, directed by Zhao Liang. Zhao Liang actually first came to prominence as the director of a different documentary called Petition about this petitioning system. But this film is one of my absolute favorites from him. Now, I will say, one thing to probably know about this film, if you're thinking about assigning it, it's 90 minutes long, and unlike a lot of other documentaries, it doesn't have talking heads, and indeed, it has almost no dialogue whatsoever. It is just a kind of 90-minute tone poem, sort of a film that is kind of depicting the kind of both widespread structural economic destruction created by open pit coal mining, but also the particular impacts that this coal mining has on coal workers and steel smelters and the like. Um, uh, One of my favorite things about teaching this film is I think because it's presented in such a unique way, it actually provides an opportunity to kind of think very critically about the choices that filmmakers are making. Why is the film presented this way? What are the consequences of it being, dialogue free? The film is very much structured actually around an allusion to Dante's Divine Comedy. There's kind of an explicit set of references to the Divine Comedy. We have sort of the bulk of the film takes place in the Inferno, where we kind of actually go into the coal mines, into the steel smelting kind of factories, sort of looking at just the extremely kind of harsh, difficult, and sometimes, quite frankly, scary conditions of these workspaces. But it also engages this idea of sort of the purgatorio, this notion of kind of the status that workers are placed in. It features, again, not interviews, but footage of Chinese coal miners who are not only sort of struggling with the difficult work of coal mining, but also with its consequences, notably black lung disease, this very common respiratory disease that results from folks who spend a long time in the mines. And probably most uh, unique to China, the end of the film ends with a sort of paradise. Although in this case, so much of the coal and steel that is produced is used to construct buildings as part of China's broader kind of real estate bubble in what essentially turn out to be ghost cities. So in the same way that sort of in Davante's Divine Comedy, almost no one actually lives in paradise. That's also true in this film, where we spend the last sort of chunk of the film in one of these ghost cities in which enormous amounts of environmental destruction and personal health destruction have all been sort of sacrificed in order to create these giant shining skyscrapers where no one lives, and no one kind of occupies these buildings. It's just a complete kind of ghost city that I think is reflective of China's broader economic bubble. Um, so this film, I think, engages. Um, Parts of the film cover the sort of collective petitioning efforts of coal miners who are dealing with black lung disease, but I think this film is also just kind of a powerful protest voice in and of itself, and one that's great to engage with. So the final source of protest, and in some ways one of the ones that's the most common, is that of forced evictions. According to a think tank, which is admittedly sort of interested in issues of land use rights, um, recent data suggests that forced evictions accounted for about 65% of all mass conflicts or protests in China since about a decade ago. Part of this actually has to do with kind of the unique property law in China. The vast majority of property in China is technically either owned by the state or owned by rural collectives. Um, since some recent property laws were passed in the last decade or so, individual homeowners do have more rights than they used to, but it's still the case that sort of issues like eminent domain are much stronger in China than they are here, say, in the United States. And so it's much easier for sort of states to or real estate developers to basically try to force people out of their homes. Some folks have resisted these efforts. It's actually led to this phenomenon of what are called nail houses, Dingsihu, you see over here, where residents basically refuse to sign paperwork approving demolition of their homes. And so you actually see places where, entire skyscrapers have been demolished except for like one middle strand, or you'll see here this kind of famous example where essentially a major highway was built around a private residence. Um, but I think this is clearly one of the examples where forced displacement is one of the major kind of concerns for a lot of Chinese, especially in urban centers, where all the time you'll see a brand new skyscraper being built to be an apartment complex, only for that same skyscraper to be torn down a decade later to build a yet taller skyscraper. A lot of the kind of infrastructure challenges in China today, particularly around sort of earthquake resiliency and fire resiliency, stem from the fact that most real estate developers don't expect buildings to be up for more than a decade or so before being replaced by, yet larger infrastructure. Um, so one of the probably most famous and well-known incidences of kind of forced displacement occurred with the construction of the Three Gorges Dam. And it's really sort of hard to overstate the scale of this particular civil engineering project. So the Three Gorges Dam itself is over 2,000 meters long. It's the world's largest hydroelectric dam in the world. It sort of spans the Yangtze River. It was constructed kind of over more than a decade. And it's been enormously important to sort of fulfilling China's overall energy needs. It produces, over 22,000 megawatts of electricity. One study from NASA actually says that by slowing the flow of the Yangtze River, this dam has actually slowed the Earth's rotation by about 0.06 microseconds per day, just because of the shift in the mass of water as a result of this dam. And there's actually emerging evidence that the dam is not entirely successful in retaining the water. It started to bend a little bit in ways that are of major concern for those worried that it might degrade over time. But for our circumstances, I think one of the most important things to know about this dam is that by creating this large reservoir on the other side of the dam, you can see in these images in the bottom left, it's flooded huge swaths of what were otherwise very densely populated regions, ultimately displacing over 1.3 million people. To this day, probably I think the most well-known documentary about contemporary China is this film called Up the Yangtze by director Yun Chang, who is a Chinese Canadian director. There is a free version of it that's on YouTube. You can also get it on Apple TV. So this film follows kind of two teenagers who are working on a Yangtze River cruise ship, serving predominantly sort of wealthy Western tourists. It focuses on kind of two teenagers, but one of them, Yu Shui, who's known by the Americans on the ship as Cindy, comes from a poor family that's basically been forced to evacuate their homes due to all of this flooding. And I think in thinking about her family's changing circumstances and then also the work that she is doing that's more kind of catering to this wealthy elite, I think it really captures kind of China's broader sort of transition from an agricultural to a consumer society. I think it's really useful to look at documentaries that focus on the lives of teenagers. I think it can be very eye-opening for our students, in teaching in a high school to 16-year-olds, kind of thinking critically about what does life look like for a 16-year-old in a different part of the world. And just thinking more broadly about what are kind of the consequences of economic development. So before I go, I wanted to just briefly share just a couple of other quick, fantastic documentaries. So I mentioned already Zhao Liang's earlier film, Petition, follows a group of petitioners kind of seeking out government corruption. This particular group is ultimately much less successful than the Warriors of Chiogong. Probably one of the documentaries that my students have most enjoyed watching is this film called Please Vote for Me, which actually looks at a democratic election for a third grade class monitor in a middle class elementary school. And if trust me, you are not prepared for how cutthroat these third graders can be. And there's actually quite a lot of tears shed and devious tactics used to sort of pursue this goal of becoming third grade class monitor. And then I also always teach when I'm teaching about migrant labor in contemporary China. I use this incredible film, Last Train Home, which tracks a family of kind of migrant workers who are kind of returning to their rural home for the Chinese New Year. And it looks at kind of the consequences of how economic reform has led to this kind of migrant work lifestyle that not only sort of subjects workers to harsh conditions, but really creates huge strains on families. Um, so yeah, more broadly, I just think documentaries are a fantastic way to kind of offer new perspectives on China, but oftentimes all the documentaries that I've shared today are produced by either Chinese citizens or folks in the Chinese diaspora. And I think sometimes those voices and those perspectives are really useful, especially in a contemporary context where a lot of American media on China is, I think, kind of interlaced with, xenophobia and things like that. I also think anytime you look at a documentary, it's a fantastic way to kind of think about those choices of authorship, right? So anytime we're watching a documentary, we're not just sort of watching it for the content, but we're thinking about, well, why did the director organize these sources in this way? What are the consequences of their decisions? What is their particular point of view? What impact does it have? So I think it helps to kind of promote kind of critical thinking about source material. And then finally, just I know if your students are anything like mine, and no offense to my current and former students who are on this call, not everyone always can, do the reading. And so sometimes I think just doing a documentary film where everyone has access to the material and can do the reading either in class, right? Warriors of Chiogong's only 40 minutes. I think it can provide a platform for kind of showing how effective kind of this focused analysis can be. And I just want to give one shout out to probably my favorite actual documentary series. There's a TV series called A Bite of China, which is basically like imagine like Planet Earth, but that budget applied to Chinese food, and sort of a tour of Chinese dishes and cuisine, and it's really fantastic. So okay, we've been going for a little while now, so I suggest we take a short break. We will come back and hear from Professor Tim Stequerda and Professor Tane Duncan in the next section. I have a little Princess Mononoke preview here. Um, since we're already kind of we had to spend a little bit more time on the introductions, I actually propose we go ahead and take a 10-minute break and come back at 1:50, and then we can move forward. If that's okay with Dr. Duncan and Dr. Stequerda's schedule.
That's fine. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, brilliant. In that case, I will pause the recording, take a hit of Dayquil, and then see everybody back here in about 10 minutes for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Zach. I'm very happy to be here. Bridging the gulf between K through 12 and higher education is a really important issue, I think. So happy to present today. Let me see if, okay, can everyone,
Looks good to me.
is it full screen or
It's not full screen. It looks like
are we?
there now it is.
Okay, great. So first off, has anyone seen a Miyazaki or Studio Ghibli film before? Thumbs up. Okay, aside from Zach, Dr. Smith. No. Has anyone seen an anime before? Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. So Miyazaki's films, I would argue, are a major reason that anime has become more critically accepted in the United States. Miyazaki has been active as an animator for about 60 years. Studio Ghibli, his films are immensely popular in both Japan and the United States. His film Spirited Away was the first anime or Japanese animated film to win an Oscar in 2003, after the category of Best Animated Feature was invented. So I'll just go over Miyazaki as a director and animator a little bit and some of his personal philosophy before diving into an analysis of Princess Mononoke as I would teach it in a freshman film and literature course, which I actually will be later this semester. I wasn't quite sure. This was aimed at high school educators, so hopefully I don't go off on too many tangents, but try to keep it focused. So Miyazaki was born in 1941 when the Japanese Empire was near its zenith, right before Pearl Harbor. Very quickly, though, the country entered what's called the Dark Valley of total war. Miyazaki grew up under the omnipresent threat of American air raids, which ultimately culminated in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This imparted a strong belief in pacifism and opposition to wartime militarism. And this it carries over in a lot of his works, as we'll see in a second. Miyazaki is very interested in Japanese history, but he has an alternative vision that attempts to downplay elements such as samurai or the emperor, these tropes in Japanese history that we commonly think of as being an essential part of Japanese culture and representations of it in cinema. And that's something I'll touch on at the end, because ironically, he's actually the commonly seen as the best known Japanese director in the West after Kurosawa Akira, who is best known for pioneering samurai film such as Rashomon, Seven Samurai, and really uh, breaking Japanese cinema into the American market. So Miyazaki has a very lengthy filmography, but for the purposes of teaching his films in the high school classroom, I wanted to highlight some other films aside from Princess Mononoke that touch on issues of environmentalism. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This is a very powerful film, one of his first actually when Studio Ghibli started, that deals with a princess trying to save her people from extinction in a post-apocalyptic landscape that has been scarred and transmogrified by thermonuclear warfare and pollution. Both Nausicaa and Princess Mononoke are quite violent and dark, so I wouldn't use them in an elementary or middle school classroom, but they're probably appropriate for high school students. By contrast, Castle in the Sky and My Neighbor Totoro are much more family friendly. Both of them are sort of coming of age movies that deal with issues about technology and how to navigate and change, not specifically environmental change. Castle in the Sky, in particular, deals with how much power we should cede technology in our daily lives. And My Neighbor Totoro is a very sweet film about a girl navigating her new life in the countryside after her mother passes away. She's being raised by a single father. And it's a coming of age story that features her adventures with these colorful animistic spirits from Miyazaki's imagination and somewhat from Japanese folklore. Because this is aimed at high school educators, I just wanted to touch on how we could use Miyazaki's films in the high school classroom. As a college educator, I have a bit more flexibility, and I know public high school does have a different set of standards, but I do believe that Miyazaki's films in particular could be used as comparative sources for teaching about the environment, in comparison to, say, Thoreau, Emerson, or Melville. Some literature that's commonly associated with eco-criticism, particularly for advanced or AP English classes, not exclusively though. Any of Miyazaki's films could easily be used as supplemental sources for units on world literature. And I won't touch on this too much because fine art isn't my field. I'm working cultural studies, but elective courses on visual arts and animation, you could easily integrate Miyazaki's films into that. And then finally, for Princess Mononoke specifically, I would say it's suitable as a supplemental source for world history classes. The film is in essence fantasy, but as I'll talk about, it has a lot of anachronistic blurring of Japanese time periods to impart its allegorical messages. So I think it would be very rich for discussion in a history class as well. Before diving into Princess Mononoke and issues concerning ecology and culture, I wanted to talk a little bit about Miyazaki's personal philosophies, personal environmental philosophies, particularly as they relate to Japanese religious traditions and culture in general. So as I've said, Miyazaki is a pacifist, and this carries over to his environmentalism. He sees war and violence as inherently destructive. And he's talked many times at length about how he never wants to see the sort of destruction that was visited upon Japan during the wartime ever again. And while I wouldn't say Miyazaki is anti-American per se, he does see Western culture in America as possessing a sort of materialism that separates humanity from nature. And more broadly, he sees this in Western philosophy, particularly Kantian and Cartesian thought, this idea that humanity is above nature, this idea of anthropocentrism. He rejects that sort of dualism and sees humanity and nature, animate, inanimate, nature and nurture, as inextricably interconnected. And this is rooted in his animistic reverence for nature that sees the landscapes, particularly forests, seas, other um, topographic features as living entities. This idea of animism is particularly tricky in relation to Miyazaki. A lot of Western critics have linked it to Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, Japan's oldest religion, some people have said, that predates Buddhism. Miyazaki is quite ambivalent about this. He has a very, I wouldn't say negative attitude towards Shinto, but he sees animism, this primitive religion that once characterized all of Japan, as something much older than Shinto. For him, Shinto is tainted by its wartime associations with the emperor and this destruction that was visited upon Japan. So he has his own particular twist on Shinto and animism. For him, this idea that you can domesticate religion, no, that reeks of Western philosophy and materialism. And so I've chosen some quotes from his collection of interviews about him not going to certain shrines because he sees it as, an artifice of Japan's true spirituality, which is away from which is at one part of humanity, but also away from urban centers where it could be domesticated. So I've included some quotes here outlining his beliefs. He has a tendency himself to go off on tangents, so I've edited them down for clarity. And on this issue of animism, one interesting thing is that as an animator, he sees anime, Japanese animation, as an extension of animism. This is, the first time I heard this, I was a little, puzzled. There is actually an entire body of literature in Japanese studies on the connection between animation and animism. For Miyazaki, this idea that even inanimate objects have agency and autonomy, can be endowed with ontological essence, naturally carries over to his work as an animator, because anime allows you to show the dynamism of, say, nature as a living entity. Particularly for Princess Mononoke, he wanted to show the viridescence, the vibrancy of this biome as an animated force on screen. And again, here's another quote on the right here. This is from an essay I've been translating by Miyazaki that tries to capture what his artistic vision for Princess Mononoke was. The film, of course, is much larger than a single tree, but these very poetic descriptions that fuse both spirituality and science highlight what he was attempting to convey with the film, I think. Haven't finished the translation, but wanted to share a snippet. Okay, Princess Mononoke. So the film is set in the 14th century in the Muromachi period. This was a period sandwiched between the end of the Kamakura shogunate and the beginning of the Edo period under Tokugawa Ieyasu, which is fictionalized in the Hulu series Shogun. Miyazaki saw the Muromachi period as the beginning of when the Japanese people attempted to extensively domesticate the land around them. He saw this as the beginning of when they began to clear the vast forests covering the archipelago, primarily as fuel for these internecine wars between feudal warlords. One of the defining features, even though it is set in medieval Japan, is this anachronistic blurring of temporalities. Princess Mononoke is very allegorical, and I'll touch on how Miyazaki's commenting on modern Japan. But in essence, though, the central conflict of the film deals with deforestation and this question of how far humanity should go in altering their landscapes. The story of Princess Mononoke follows an Amishi prince, Ashitaka, pictured at the top left, riding his red elk, who has been cursed. At the beginning of the film, he is defending his village from a giant boar god, a giant boar covered in these horrific tentacles, clearly showing industrial pollution and sludge. One of the tentacles wraps around his arm and curses him. He's afflicted with this disease that's slowly consuming his body. And in search for a cure, he self-exiles himself from one of the last Amishi villages and heads west. As part of his journey west, he becomes embroiled in a conflict between Irontown, led by Lady Eboshi, pictured at the top right, who is locked in a war between the gods of the forest, led by San, pictured at the bottom. That's the princess of the film, who becomes Ashitaka's romantic interest. It is ultimately an anime for teenagers, and who's been adopted by wolves. And they are defending the forest from Lady Eboshi. The forest itself is, I guess you'd say, led or personified, would be a better term, by what's called the deer god or the forest spirit in English translation, pictured at the top right. This is sort of god of nature, personification of nature. Lady Eboshi is trying to kill the forest god and clear the forest. And the forest, as you can see, is clearly pictured as a living entity. At the bottom right, you see the iconic Kodoma, the tree spirits, which show the forest as a living force, very cute little Kokopelli-like creatures. But this is not a simplistic narrative of good versus evil. Eboshi isn't single-mindedly trying to destroy the forest to exploit it. Irontown is a safe haven for the outcasts of Muromachi, Japan. You see the town at top left, and its sterile landscape contrasts sharply with the primordial forest. The town is made up of outcasts from Japanese society, including women who have, had to flee their villages. There's gender equality between the men and women in the town. It's led by Lady Eboshi, which was extremely uncommon in medieval Japan. And most interestingly, a colony of lepers are actually the ones producing the muskets with the iron, these muskets that are being used to kill the gods of the forest. This allows them to earn a living and retain some dignity. So you can see Irontown, it's really a safe haven also in an inhospitable landscape. These are people that would probably perish otherwise in this ongoing civil war. So it's not a simplistic narrative, as I said. It's a very ambiguous environmental message that unfolds. Moreover, Lady Eboshi is in many ways being manipulated by this enigmatic monk who wants to kill the forest spirit, the deer god, on orders from the emperor. And the influence of this, the emperor never appears on screen, but there is this influence of imperialism, which again, I think functions as an allegory for the manipulation of the Japanese people during the war. You can see here on left, this enigmatic monk, Jinko, has a charter from the emperor, and they're attempting to hunt the forest god, who has two different forms. He's depicted as a deer god, but also as a night walker. Sort of, I don't really know what to describe him, but this larger than life creature that wanders through the forest at night. So before going into some of the environmental issues represented in Princess Mononoke, I do want to touch on an important aspect of the protagonist, Ashitaka. He is Emishi. He's not Japanese. The Emishi, they're of an uncertain ethnicity. They were semi-nomadic peoples of northern Japan, particularly northern Honshu and southern Hokkaido, who came into conflict with the imperial court at Kyoto in central Japan, in Kansai. From roughly the 8th century onwards, they appear as barbarians in a lot of early imperial chronicles. They were fully subdued by the Muromachi period. But what Miyazaki's doing is attempting to blur two indigenous peoples together. This early scenes in this Emishi village, Miyazaki's also using elements of the Ainu people. These are indigenous peoples of Hokkaido that were probably related to the Emishi, but again, the ethnic composition is a little uncertain. So again, this blurring of temporalities, the Amishi were fully colonized by the Muromachi period, whereas the Ainu were resisting Japanese rule. And I believe Miyazaki is portraying this proto-colonial relationship unfolding in Princess Mononoke. Um, Again, I do want to, I go back and forth about whether Miyazaki is using the noble savage trope, but I do think it's important that one of the films in the West that's been seen as conveying, quintessential forms of Japanese culture and ecology has a protagonist from an indigenous minority. So, especially in a high school discussion, this would be something to highlight, and I certainly would when teaching it later in the term. Again, going back to this issue of blurring temporalities, Irontown is clearly depicted as a proto-industrial town. The images of the foundries where the iron is produced and where these blunderbusses and muskets are being manufactured is reminiscent of early factory scenes produced by artists such as Doré or Blake. Dark satanic mills immediately comes to mind. So, although it's fantasy, Miyazaki depicts the world of Princess Mononoke on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, or the Great Divergence, to borrow the term from Kenneth Pomeranz. The circulation of muskets or blunderbusses, arquebuses, the firearms are a little ambiguous in the film, also hints at the presence of Europeans in Japan. The Europeans hadn't reached Japan. The Jesuits, Spaniards, the British hadn't reached there by the 14th century. This comes actually about a century and a half later. But again, it does depict this early form of globalization indirectly, in the same way that the emperor is kind of an extra diegetic force in the movie. The Europeans and global trade is shown as influencing these far-flung locations in Japan. So the industrialization depicted in Irontown also hints at the broader ramifications of the Industrial Revolution that would afflict modern Japan following the Meiji period, when Japan embarked on an aggressive campaign to modernize and join the ranks of the modern industrial powers. Although Japan is often seen as having an innate reverence, innate connection for nature, something Miyazaki shares, Miyazaki is also aware of the wicked irony of Japan attempting to modernize and exploiting their natural environments, which is central to the conflict of Princess Mononoke. The way pollution and industrial disease is depicted in Princess Mononoke, I think Miyazaki's referencing several different disasters, including the Ashio copper mine incident, one of the first environmental disasters in Japan, where mining runoff from this copper mine killed a lot of fisheries and poisoned some fishing communities downstream. More infamously is Minamata disease. This was much more severe. Discharge of methyl mercury from a manufacturing plant poisoned fish outside of a township in Hiroshima and led to an extensive poisoning among this community that affected both the central nervous system and the brain. It stunted the development, and the placenta was passed on to children. There are several generations of victims of Minamata disease. And as you can see at the top left there, it led to these stunted bodies and quivering motions. That was the first signs of disease were actually seen in cats and dogs, who would have spasms and jump around before ultimately perishing. And then, although Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not a disaster perpetrated by the Japanese, Japan does have a very traumatic history with radiation, ultimately culminating in the 3/11 triple disaster. And then even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's been perennial controversy about the use of nuclear energy in Japan. Japanese fishermen were exposed to residual radiation from American testing in the Pacific. So again, all of these industrial disasters, both in war and peace, I think make their way into Miyazaki's representation of industrial pollution and disease in Princess Mononoke. Ashitaka's curse manifests itself as a spasm. He often can't control his arm, and the disease consumes him. Again, on the right there, this is clearly referencing pollution. After the boar god perishes, he begins to consume the landscape around him. It withers like an oil spill disaster, such. And then, of course, again, these spasms, I believe, are clearly referencing Minamata disease. Anything else? Okay. Ashitaka's struggle to cure himself of this industrial affliction ultimately culminates in his attempt to save the forest god after he is killed by Eboshi in an effort to deliver the forest god's head to the emperor to secure safety for the inhabitants of Irontown. The death of the forest god drives home Miyazaki's point that humanity and nature are imbricated together. The death of the forest god is shown as the death of nature itself. It begins to mutate into a giant, I don't even know what to call it, a puddle of sludge that slowly consumes the forest. You can see the tree spirits dying here and the trees beginning to wither. So again, this exemplifies Miyazaki's view that nature is a living force in this animistic ecosystem. You can't destroy a biome without destroying part of humanity. So to wrap up, I'll just say about Miyazaki's representations of Japanese history and ecology that he's attempting a new version of what's called a Jidaigeki, going back to Kurosawa at the beginning of the presentation. Kurosawa was the master of the period piece, the Jidaigeki, and I believe Miyazaki is trying to update it for the age of climate change and the Anthropocene. Stock characters from Japanese history, such as samurai, the shogun, and the emperor, only appear briefly. Samurai are shown as rapacious and not at all, upholding Bushido. Instead, the people driving history are women, day laborers, lepers, peoples on the edge of society who are engaged in transforming the environment, but only to really protect themselves. So I would say this shows that Miyazaki is not attempting a simplistic, good versus evil. I'll drive that home, that environmental change, climate change is much more complicated and that there are no true villains or heroes. This requires cooperation and understanding of man and nature and how they work in symbiosis. So, in general, I would say Princess Mononoke is a strike against anthropocentrism and moving away from these heroic narratives of Japanese history towards a much more complex meditation on how Japan should navigate in the age of globalization, climate change. And then finally, again, because this is aimed at high school educators, I included some discussion questions that I might use when teaching this film. So I think I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. That's really, I've seen this movie a million times and it helped me think about it in new ways. So thank you so much.
We'll stop.
And yeah, there's another quick reminder too that any of the folks attending who are either currently teaching in a high school or perhaps in our BSc program, we're going to try to send you a complimentary copy of Princess Mononoke as well. I fully support using this film in the classroom. It seems like such a fantastic opportunity to engage so many different issues. So okay, well, we will roll right along to our final presenter, Dr. Tane Duncan. She is the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and the director of the Interdisciplinary Gender Studies program here at UCA. Her research specialties include feminist philosophy, critical theory, intersubjectivity. She's doing work on human nature, But I'll say for me, she's been an enormously important sort of mentor to me and has been a fantastic advocate for Asian studies, in part through her work with the Asian Studies Development Program, and really just kind of bringing together a lot of interdisciplinary conversations with folks here on campus. She's one of my favorite teachers. So today she is discussing imagining community, considerations of gender in ecological and Asian futurist frameworks. So thank you so much, Dr. Duncan, and I'm excited to learn from you.
Aw, thank you. I hope that you feel better too, Zach.
Thank
And and the admiration is mutual. Absolutely. I know that I would not be the teacher that I am now if it were not for our exchanges. I want to, before I actually share my screen and share my PowerPoint here, also express my gratitude to Dr. Tom Williams, the dean of our college, who actually is currently sitting with me in Shishal 115. So attending kind of a watch party version of this and has been supportive of our presentations here today. It really means a lot to me to have that level of support from our dean and support for our college and these endeavors. And he is also sponsoring a reception tonight for some of our out-of-town presenters who happen to be with us today. I also just want to extend a reminder to folks as well that Stanley Chen's talk this evening at 5:30 is going to be incredible. He has been a lovely human to interact with in planning to present tonight, but also his work is really incredible. And I've taught portions of it this semester. I know that it would also be eminently teachable in a variety of contexts. So I highly recommend folks who might be interested in that to come to tonight as well. You might actually get some pedagogical and content-based kind of suggestions from his talk tonight too. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and I'm gonna see if I can do the very technical and advanced thing where I can share part of my screen from a presenter view. We'll see if it actually works. I've only managed to do this a few times. Can you see my whole screen now? Is it the presenter view now? Darn it.
We're seeing the presenter view. Like,
Yeah.
we can see the next slide.
Yeah, that's a bummer. Okay. Let me okay. Let me go ahead and just share back the regular screen. Okay. And so I thought I was going to be able to do this advanced share technique and it is not going to work for me. Okay, so let me go ahead and go back to this. So what I want to talk about today is actually the culmination of a lot of work that I have done since 2012, 2013 in coordination with the Asian Studies Development Program. So I'm so happy that Peter Hershok is here participating in our conversation today. He will be presenting tomorrow during the second day of our conference as well, because his work has really been an invaluable help for me in developing my awareness and understanding of the importance of Asian studies and Asian philosophy into a variety of things that have been really important to me in terms of my research agenda for a long time, but that I just didn't have the expertise in. And one of those things that Zach already alluded to that's been a really important kind of foundation for my research and just intersecting with my research is the notion of community or beloved community that I take from Bell Hooks's philosophy. That's been at the foundation of my approach to critical theory. So I know, especially in the world today and in the news and the way that we talk about critical theory, it often sounds like it is an approach that is negative or coming after certain ways of thinking or being or engaging in the world. Often it's kind of caricaturized as maybe being against traditional values, but in fact, critical theory has deep roots in the idea of community building and liberation and connection. And I really find that approach to critical theory to be central to my approach to philosophy and my approach to teaching. And so what I'm going to talk about in terms of critical theory and what I've learned through working with the Asian Studies Development Program for the past several years is how we understand this notion of beloved community in relation to ecological commitments, ecological flourishing, and kind of a broadened sense of community. So I have some guiding questions here that kind of shaped the way that I wanted to engage in discussion today. How do we see the world? Do we see it from the perspective of an individual, or do we understand it in terms of community? Do we feel trapped in the current environmental crisis, or do we see our responsibilities to the crisis and opportunities for envisioning a better world? And I think that there are a variety of ways that we can address or answer these questions. I'm just going to focus a little bit on certain approaches to ecological flourishing that I take from feminist philosophy and Buddhist philosophy, and some ideas for how we can envision the future that I take from Asian futurism. These frameworks help us to imagine other ways of seeing and being and the relationship between community and flourishing. And so I'm going to go through basically 3 different approaches that I've incorporated into my own teaching that address these questions. The first is a Buddhist monk, Ikkyu Sojin, and some of his poetry that I've incorporated into my philosophy of sex and love course, which I know again sounds scary, but our second unit in that course is actually about love of nature and our commitment to the notion of flourishing in nature in the community. And Sojin has this concept of a red thread that binds us, that really helps to lay out what is meant by this kind of community that we have mutual obligations to. From that perspective, I reflect on some of the lessons that I've learned in reading Buddhist feminist thought, including American Buddhist feminist thought, as well as Asian Buddhist thought. Bell Hooks herself, in addition to being a critical theorist, was also a Buddhist practitioner and Buddhist theorist. And so some of her philosophy comes into that, as well as the philosophy of Chris Cuomo, who talks about ecological feminism. And then finally, turning to that notion of Asian futurism and what I'm calling artistry in everyday life as one way that we can encourage students to think about how to respond with imagination for building a flourishing community. And so in 2013, I was able to participate in one of the infusing institutes that Peter Hershok mentioned at the beginning of our discussion today. The opportunities to come and study with the Asian Studies Development Program in Hawaii for a concentrated, kind of focused opportunity to develop and to grow, to attend lectures from experts from all over the world, but also with the intentional purpose of helping to develop new ways of teaching and incorporating that information into your classes. And one of the things that stood out to me most during my Infusing Institute really came from a lecture that Peter gave, maybe in the first few days, I think, of our time together at the Infusing Institute on Ikkyu Sojin. And this particular Buddhist monk stood out to me at this time, in part because he rejected the idea of a binary or a separation between a spiritual world and an embodied world. He rejected the idea that we should ignore, right, what is happening in the world, what is happening to other people, what is happening in relation with other people to our environment, and instead really centered his meditative practices and his approach on the idea of interconnection, of embodiment. He even wrote poetry all about sex and love and food, and all of the things that we might consider to be wholly embodied pleasures. But there are 2 poems of his in particular that I have started to utilize in my own classes to talk about this idea of a red thread that binds us. Both of them come from a collection that's been translated as Crow with No Mouth. And the first poem is, "You can't be anyone but you, therefore you are that other one you love." And as someone who's been trained in feminist philosophy of the West, I was really interested in at least the translator's purpose for capitalizing the O and other. In transnational and Western feminist philosophies, anytime you capitalize other in this way, it really signifies this idea that it is someone who is marginalized, separated from, in some way kind of mystified as something that is unknowable or someone who is unknowable. And I think this poem actually subverts our expectations with this idea of separation. It says that, in fact, when you know yourself, you are only able to know yourself through engagement with others in the world who are different and distinct from you, right? It foundationally says that there is this way in which our self-understanding, our self-love, our self-knowledge is connected to our commitments to or engagements with, but still our fundamental distinctions with others. Another one of his poems that stood out to me and I've utilized in my feminist philosophy as well as philosophy of sex and love course is this poem that says, "Believe in the man facing you now, just narrow your eyes, feel the deep love." And this idea again emphasizes intersubjectivity and interconnection, and the idea that others are going to be the ones who open your eyes to the necessity for action and engagement and purpose. And the fact that others in the world are what is going to motivate our commitment to improvement and imagination. And so I use these poems in my philosophy of sex and love class to emphasize the foundation of community. We asked this question in the second unit of my philosophy of sex and love class, but I think this could be applied in all different contexts. It doesn't have to be rooted in sex and love specifically. It's about community flourishing, the environment, and our commitments to one another. We can ask this question, what is meant by ecological community, and why does it matter to both Western feminist philosophy and Buddhist perspectives? And I've got a variety of sources that I've highlighted on this slide. I know we're sharing our slideshows, particular quotes that I've kind of pulled out from each of them that I incorporate into my classes as well. But I'm really just going to focus on two of these right now for the sake of time, because I do want us to have some discussion at the end. So one of the quotes that always stands out to me is from Nelson and her work Beyond Small is Beautiful, a Buddhist and feminist analysis of ethics and business. I like to emphasize to students who might be coming from a variety of disciplines that these principles apply to them, whether or not they're philosophy students, religious studies students, gender studies students, it doesn't matter. This ethical approach is about all different types of community. And Nelson writes in her work, in relations of mutuality, people have mutual respect and mutual constitutive influence. They help each other grow and develop in healthy ways. The image can also be extended to the idea of humans as co-constituted with a creative and value-imbued natural world, right? So that co-constitution not only of other people being in relation to each other, but people being in relation to the rest of the natural world becomes the foundation for thinking about ecological community. And Chris Cuomo, who's one of the main texts that I teach in that philosophy of sex and love course, specifically her book, Feminism and Ecological Communities, she writes, living feminist environmental ethics entails, for some of us, a radical shift in how one sees and interacts with the world. It also requires attention to who we are in the world. And part of the reason I pair these two quotes or comments together is that Nelson understands that a Buddhist perspective that we can see in alignment with Ikkyusojin, is something that already takes for granted interconnectedness, right? It is foundational to this way of thinking about the environment and community. Whereas Chris Cuomo takes for granted what we might consider to be a more traditional Western conception of the way in which we engage in the world, which is primarily individualistic. She sees a notion of intersubjectivity and interdependence on the environment as something that is radical rather than something that is part of the tradition. And so that conversation or that dialogue, how do we frame the role of subjects in relation to the environment? How is it influenced by culture, by community, by context, right? These are really nice questions to raise for students by pairing these two ideas together. I also think that there is some interesting ways in which the concept of interdependence on nature, or the ways in which human flourishing is dependent upon environmental and ecological flourishing, is explored through this kind of combination of Western feminist and Buddhist principles. In Cuomo's work, she calls this dynamic charm, hearkening back actually to Western physics conceptions of the way in which quantum particles interact with each other and relate to each other. But she also expands this back out to the biological kind of macrobiotic level as well. And Chris Cuomo identifies this as being the core of her book that I teach in that class. But Naomi Zak also acknowledges and expands on this. And I wanted to insert her here as well, because the lessons from Naomi Zak kind of pull us into thinking about broader social questions, broader social issues, as well as greater ethical commitments. Naomi Zak is actually a political theorist who focuses on questions of human rights. And so her ability to expand these questions of ecological interdependence and intersubjective interdependence can be framed in ways that we can apply to a variety of disciplines. And I'm not going to read these two quotes at you, but I do want to pull out this central insight. The dynamic charm of non-human living beings is what alerts us to their moral status. Human beings are central in ecological feminist ethics, but their flourishing requires the presence of non-human living beings in a social and natural community capable of supporting the flourishing of all of its members. And so what I do with students after we lay this groundwork, that we lay this framework, we talk about the cultural context, we talk about these different views of individual versus social, of non-human and human interaction versus kind of human centrality, which we heard in the last presentation, right? This notion of the anthropocentric view. Right after I lay all of these questions, then I start to think about ways in which we can form those questions into particular types of assignments that motivate students to apply this directly. And so in my classes, including philosophy of sex and love and feminist philosophy, where I introduce these ideas, I actually have students do service learning work. And we ground this service learning work in this idea that we have a responsibility, not only to understand the theory, but to really trace how this theory matters for the way that we should and can interact in the world. And so in another article that Chris Cuomo wrote specifically about climate crisis, she says differential responsibilities of nations and the disproportionate vulnerabilities of females, people of color, and the economically disadvantaged in relation to climate change affect ethical responsibility. So when I introduce the assignment to students, we talk about who are the vulnerable populations in our community. We don't just take for granted, right, these categories. We actually address where are their particular vulnerabilities. And as an example, I've got two different service learning projects that my students, in thinking about that question of vulnerabilities, developed. So I always take the approach that for service learning, it's something that we kind of mutually create or constitute together. I have some potential partners we can work with, but I really want to make sure that students take ownership for this. And so in one particular section of my philosophy of sex and love class, after we'd worked through these ideas from Buddhist philosophy and feminist philosophy, students elected to do two different service projects. They kind of split in half about developing ecological communities on our campus. One of the groups created a teaching resource guide for children to explore the Jewel Moore Nature Preserve on UCA's campus, with a special focus on teaching non-anthropocentric views of nature. This was really incredible. They created different activities. It was an opportunity for them to consider, okay, how do I understand this, but how can I make this understandable or relatable to someone who might not have read this more complicated philosophical literature, but still needs to have this notion of ethical obligation and interdependence. And they actually created this teaching guide to be able to be used by the Audubon Society, where one of my former students runs the programming division. And so they were able to create a program that they could put into practice in the Jewel Moore Nature Preserve on campus. There's all kinds of intersections of community that emerged from that too, and this kind of stake in what's here on our campus that helps them to become aware of their own ecological community. The other group in this particular class created a list of resources for a possible virtual eco tour of campus for current and prospective students. These students were tasked with thinking about the nested communities and interdependencies that make up the ecosystem of UCA, campus, Conway, Central Arkansas, the intersections between nature and business, and the actual environment we take classes in, as well as live in if they live on campus. This was a really great project that my students were motivated to do, but it wasn't something that ever came to fruition in terms of access to others. The commitment to making a sustainable virtual eco tour was something that was not possible for a class to develop, right, and make available for UCA for the future as well. And so I also like to mention this example of a possible application of these theories because it was still really helpful for the students to work through, even though it didn't necessarily have the long-standing social impact that they'd intended. And I think that's a really important lesson with any type of civic learning or service learning or engaged community learning that you might be doing in any class. Sometimes it's not going to work out exactly as planned. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's failed. It can still be a really important learning experience. And that might be a better metric than thinking about direct community impact, since that's really hard to make sustainable anyway. One of the other things that we did in this class and connects to some of the ideas that I've continued to extend and develop in more recent classes, as well as more recent scholarship, is the notion of futurisms. So a lot of what I'd laid out previously and what motivated the service project was just an awareness of something that we might consider to be a natural fact, right? Of interdependence and of the fact that we're part and parcel and embedded in an ecological community. However, for many students, once they become aware of that and once they see how interconnected we are, how deeply embedded we are into an environment, it can lead them to feeling hopeless. It can lead them to an awareness that we are in ecological crisis, that we're all embedded in this ecological crisis, that we know that this ecological crisis is going to be bad for us. I think back to Ling's presentation earlier and all of the ways in which she illustrated, right, the variety of forms of pollution. And they can get stuck there, right, with this idea, well, now I can define it. I can show that this is going to impact my flourishing, your flourishing, and the environment's flourishing, but what do we do about it? And so one of the things we've looked into is identifying futurism, and specifically Asian futurism, as a possible outlet for using creative imagining, the notion of imagination and aesthetic philosophy, as well as opportunities for engaging with interdisciplinary work in literature and religious studies as well, to conceptualize alternatives. And it's really nice because there's actually a segue into, again, using this grounding in Cuomo. Cuomo uses a famous Western feminist, futurist, Haraway, and the model of the cyborg to talk about the possibilities of flourishing, that we don't need to be kind of constrained by purity or solving all of our ecological crises in order to move forward. Instead, we can move forward with opportunity, vulnerability, and kind of a revolutionary mindset of progress without being constrained or confined to perfect solutions. And this concept aligns really well with a tradition in Asian futurism. It's a creative and visionary movement that imagines the future through the lens of Asian culture experiences and perspectives, particularly as it's developed as an academic subdiscipline. It is developed in response to what might be considered techno-Orientalism, which perpetuates fetishized stereotypes of Asia's role in the future. It places instead Asian creators and their thoughts at the forefront. And just to show you that kind of contrast, right? How many of you have seen the Blade Runner movies, either of them? Or any other really film that takes place in the future that includes a technologically advanced future? You have probably noticed that whenever we imagine that kind of future in Western culture, we represent it in film or in literature. We include the notion that somehow we're going to become both more technological and more globally Asian. There is a representation of Asian women in robots. There is a representation of Asian men as being developers of advanced technology. And so what we see is in the background, Asian culture, Asian people, Asian ideas being utilized and objectified for the purposes of imagining a future, but they're not playing roles of primary subjects. They're not playing roles in terms of a much more complex view of what the future might look like. And so what we get is something like Blade Runner, where the future of masculinity is really sad. It's really straight. It's really obsessed with a particular view of sexuality and of culture, which I can talk about in a philosophy of sex and love class. But you could also talk about in terms of imagining future relationships between human subjects in the future as well. Contrast that with someone like Greg Pak, who I highly recommend. His work as being really accessible for educators all the way up through. He has a variety of short films, comic books, as well as, I think, 2 feature-length films that he's worked on, where he really tries to combat the notion of the techno-Orientalist vision of the future with something instead like an interdependent conception of the future. So here he introduces ideas of the subjectivity of children, the subjectivity of non-human animals, and the subjectivity of mechanized creatures, which may or may not pose some interesting questions. He kind of subverts the expectation of a techno-Orientalist future by actually having robots play a central role, but robots in interdependence with other subjects. And so the example that I have here is actually a series that he's created called Cadet U. And it is a small boy and a robot who are co-protagonists and kind of driving forward a vision of a better future as well. This idea of kind of moving beyond a limited vision of where we are now, a critical vision of just the descriptive harms that have happened to us ecologically and the problems with human flourishing, and moving us into an imaginative conception of interdependent flourishing, mutual embodiment and respect, and opportunities for envisioning futures that aren't just disembodied robots and sad isolation, right? Allows students to ask all kinds of questions about how to consider others. So going back to Shojun's kind of original poem and that notion of the other and how we engage with the other, right, comes full circle here in these classes. And here again, I return to bell hooks and bell hooks's work specifically on Buddhism. In the final analysis, the radical subjectivity of no self comes to resemble Hooks's vision for artistry in everyday life, which we now see will be mournful as much as it is creative, relational, as much as it is strange and oppositional, and empowering to the extent it can tolerate the emotional complexity associated with self-loss. In this analysis of hooks, what Kelmanson is calling us to do is to think about using the role of imagination and Buddhist conceptions in order to envision not an easy out for the ecological crises and the crises of interdependent flourishing that we might find ourselves in, but instead a really complicated vision of unknowable opportunities for the future that we must be invested in because of our ethical dependence on one another. And so that's how I kind of end the course and ask students to consider what they should do next. And I wanted to leave enough time for questions, so.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Duncan. We really appreciate you sharing those perspectives. Yeah. Um, I was actually gonna suggest, in some ways, we had originally had a kind of a break and then reflection, but disclosure, since I'm fading a little bit, I was kind of wondering if we might just be able to briefly kind of reflect here and ask some questions and kind of keep up the momentum of the great presentations and then adjourn. Um, so I had a quick follow-up question for you, Dr. Duncan, kind of thinking more about, and I'll go ahead and stop recording so we can kind of just reflect more.